Hi there everyone, welcome to the video for week 13, I believe. For this video, we're going to be discussing the second half or so of Hume's Enquiry concerning human understanding. In the previous video, we did a lot of setup, right? We did a lot of sort of like explaining Hume's empiricist motivations, his movements from an analysis of metaphysics to an analysis of anthropology, and we began to set out what is called Hume's fork or the problem of induction. And this is really the fundamental problem in Hume's work for a few reasons. First of all, because it is very extreme, right? Philosophers are not, usually prone to believing that all of our knowledge about cause and effect is like illusory or not really knowledge, but only habit, as we'll see. And so for a lot of people, Hume's skepticism really strikes at the heart of what philosophy is and what is philosophy meant to do. I mean, one way of conceiving, at least, of the advance of modern science is to say that modern science gives us better causal explanations or descriptions, right? And at least on some tellings of Hume's point of view or Hume's arguments, this really threatens to endanger the whole enterprise of doing science, right? If we can't have really any knowledge of causal relations, then how is it possible for us to have anything like scientific knowledge at all? You know? And maybe while Hume wouldn't say this, some people that are Humeans are willing to take that to its proper conclusion, to say, yes, it is ultimately true that all of our reasonings about cause and effect really are unjustified, that we, don't have any further basis than habit for our belief or credence in them, right? But, this is also very troubling because it seems like, at least the way that I would want to, say, distinguish a surgeon from an astrologist, right, is that one of them has knowledge and the other one does not. And that is an important, like, my understanding that what the surgeon has is knowledge depends in an important way on knowing that the astrologist does not have knowledge in that sense. Not to rag on astrology too much, I kind of like it after all, but it doesn't provide a scientific kind of knowledge, right? I think that much is very clear. So, a lot of people, a lot of philosophers ultimately are very troubled by this problem and not very happy with Hume's skeptical conclusion about it. And so, a later philosopher that we're going to be ending the semester with, Immanuel Kant, who is arguably the most important philosopher of this period, and maybe the whole reason for why we have something like a Descartes to Kant class. He was really troubled by this stuff. We're going to be reading a small work of his where he says that David Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber, right? That's a very dramatic line. But I think that it points out that Hume is raising a really profound problem for the whole modern period, right? It doesn't seem like either of the ways that we go for trying to understand causal relations really work at all. Now, we were able to kind of touch on the very end about the nature of Hume's fork and the problem of induction, but we're going to spend roughly the first half or so of this class going over that in more detail. And so that's what we have on the left side of the board here. So at the top it just says Hume's Enquiry, Part 2. And then on this first little quadrant of the board, we are going to go through again Hume's fork by analyzing the premise that he identifies with induction, namely that the future will resemble the past, and we'll treat that as both of the kinds of reasoning that Hume says is available to us. And I'll recite a couple of arguments that Hume gives for why we cannot conceive of the inductive proposition that the future will resemble the past as either a relation of ideas or as a matter of fact. So in other words, it can't be either of the two ways that we reason about stuff. And so it must not be reasonable, rational at all. That's Hume's conclusion. And that's why it's a fork, right? It's meant to depict a fork in the road. You have to turn left or you have to turn right. And it doesn't seem like either option gets you to where you want to go, right? Okay, so let's dive into it. The future will resemble the past. So what if we thought of this as something that we could prove a priori, or in other words, something that we could prove simply as a conceptual truth or a metaphysical truth, and we didn't need to consult our experience at all, right? What if we tried to conceive of causality as that kind of relationship? Well, the problem is that causal judgments are contingent. So, thinking back also to like figures we read such as Leibniz, when we're proving something a priori, ultimately what we're doing is we're showing that its negation would lead to a contradiction, right? This is what Leibniz said was sort of like the principle of all truths of reason is the principle of non-contradiction. So when we're trying to prove something as a relation of ideas, we're trying to show that it leads to a fundamental contradiction. The problem with applying this approach to causal judgments is that by definition, causal judgments are contingent. So in other words, say I'm on like one of those reality TV shows like Alone or whatever, or like a more hardcore version of Survivor, if you know that one either, and I'm trying to start a fire, right? I've got my kindling and I'm trying my best, right? And the reason why this is good TV and it's interesting to watch, at least kind of, is that it's possible in that moment that I get the fire going, and it's possible that I don't, right? Similarly, even in the example that we think of as being the most reliable, that the sun will rise tomorrow, right? There are all sorts of improbable, yes, but nonetheless conceivable situations in which that doesn't happen, the sun gets swallowed up by a black hole or whatever, right? Or there's an eclipse or something much more anodyne, right? That right? The point is that causal judgments are by definition not absolutely necessary. In other words, we're not using the same reasoning process when we're getting causal judgments as when we are engaged in a relation of ideas, right? 2 plus 2 has to always equal 4, right? That judgment is absolutely necessary, and experience can say nothing about it. But causal judgments are, by their definition and their nature, uncertain. So as a result, you cannot use this procedure to get this conclusion. So nothing about relations of ideas will ever justify the thesis, the future will resemble the past. It's not like you could break down the concept of past or break down the concept of future and somehow get the future out of the past. Doesn't work that way. They're really distinct, right? And so since they're really distinct, there's no procedure in which I can do that, right? If you disagree, try to give one, right? Try to prove that an event is absolutely necessary. You won't be able to do it because all of our ways of coming to know about things like that are contingent. This is why, the empiricists will say that the rationalists were not that great scientists, right? Because really what science is investigating contingent events. They were way too concerned with mathematical deduction. And so relatedly, number 2 here, no deduction of an event is possible from its cause. Nothing about the nature of the sun means that it will rise tomorrow from the perspective of the earth, right? There's just no way to jump from A to B. There's no way to, through purely conceptual means, get from a cause to an effect, right? So there's no a priori deduction. There's no way to do it through pure reason. There's no Leibniz way of stacking up all the primary truths and showing that fire is going to come from kindling, right? Okay. So then you might be tempted to say, okay, but it can still be rational, right? The future will resemble the past. Probably your first instinct is to say, well, it always has, right? Every time I have expected the sun to rise tomorrow, it did, right? It in fact did. However, this argument is circular. You're trying to use the fact that the past has resembled the future to say that the past will resemble the future. But that's exactly what we're trying to figure out. What is the basis for our credence in this, right? And so it's not possible for you to appeal to the past. One way that Hume puts it is he says, our reasoning about matters of fact rely on the belief that we already have that the future will resemble the past. So you can't work backwards and justify this thesis from an empirical observation. That would be circular. Another way of putting this idea is that experience can only say what was, not what will or must be. In other words, if I, again, think about your only sources of knowledge, they're impressions or sensations and thoughts. Thoughts don't give you any new knowledge, right? And impressions just say what did happen, right? I have to make an additional inference. I have to go beyond them in some way to then say, and what happened will continue to happen. And so Hume's fork is, if these are the only two ways of proceeding through reason, neither of them get us, what we might call the inductive premise, right? This belief that the future will resemble the past. They don't fit right? They don't fit right for the concept of causality, right? They're too strict or they're not strict enough. In this case, it's too strict. The way that you prove things through deduction is absolutely necessary, right? And this one, it's not strict enough, right? Experience can only say what was, not what will or must be. We go beyond our experience whenever we make an inference to what the future is going to be like. Okay, so if our causal judgments are not rational, what are they? Where do they come from? Why do I think sometimes that the kindling, causes the fire, or the fire causes the smoke, or something like that, right? And Hume's answer is that our causal judgments are rooted in the fact of constant conjunction. So we see two things together, right? They go together all the time. And then we sort of, by nature of our habit or custom, we then assume that this will continue out into the future. And so Hume says that custom is a way of masking ignorance, right? By saying something like, everyone knows just, it's just true that the sun will rise tomorrow. Everyone knows it's common to our way of life, right? For Hume, this is a way of masking our ignorance. It's a way of avoiding the philosophical questions regarding causality and making an assumption. Now, Hume's not against this assumption. Remember, be a philosopher, but for all that, still be a man or a human being or whatever, right? And so Hume never reaches the point where he, in an everyday sense, begins to seriously doubt the reality of causality. Hume kind of thinks, well, the fact that we can't give a rational, philosophical account of causality, that doesn't change my beliefs at all, right? I continue to use salt on my food in the belief that it will make it taste better, right? Why? Because it has in the past. For Hume, the force of the inductive premise that the future will resemble the past doesn't come from reason at all, right? The fact that we're so sure of it is not a reflection of our knowledge. To the contrary, it's a reflection of our, animalistic nature. We're instinctual, and one of our instincts is to assume that the future will resemble the past. And so for Hume, causal judgments are not rational. We share the structure with animals. I mean, this is one thing that Hume says that I think is a very good argument, right? He's like, if a dog is hurt by a stick or something like that, has an abusive owner, the dog will be afraid of the stick. And Hume says, well, what's going on? Well, the dog conjoins the sensation or impression of the stick with its memories, which are painful, right? And so that's why the dog reacts in that way. And in this way, Hume's thought becomes really, really close to developments in early psychology. For those of you who know, like Pavlov was a behavioral scientist. He's sort of like one of the founders of a theoretical approach in psychology called behavioralism. And part of his basic idea is that yes, we associate impressions with one another. We have memories that are painful, right? And then when something jogs our memory, like a song or something like that, right, we go through those emotions again. And the fact that this is shared by animals, Hume thinks, pretty decisively shows it's not a rational process. It's not something that we do more because we're more intelligent. To the contrary, we become more and more deceived about the nature of this belief, right? We attribute it to being a rational thing, whereas really it's merely a biological/cultural thing. And so this is one of the ways that Hume thinks that a careful attention to human nature draws you away from this temptation in philosophy to pretend that you know more than you do, and to doubt the knowledge that you genuinely have in your everyday life in favor of these arcane philosophical things that you can never experience. I mean, it makes sense, Hume says, as like a coping strategy, or if you want to be an academic or something like that. Of course, no one can test your hypothesis, right? So no one can say that you're just wrong. And this is why Hume says that metaphysics is sort of like a natural resting place for prejudice and custom and ignorance. When we're engaged in metaphysics is when we're the most divorced from actual real knowledge in our life, and we're most guided or oriented by these things that we can never know, right? And so that's why this is an area for superstition for Hume. And so this culminates kind of in a critique of the idea of force, right? We think about, forces in physics, right? You talk about gravitational force, electromagnetic force, and it's a way of describing how in causal relationships, one event makes another event necessary in some way. But according to Hume, this is really a way of hypostatizing something that is a thought, but not an impression. Hypostatizing something means that you're like making something real when it's not real, right? So like whenever you're a kid, so like when I was a kid, I got scared of Harry Potter for some reason, right? And you're just making something that's real and getting scared of it, even though it's not really there. So similarly, or you don't have any evidence of it at least. So similarly, Hume says when we start talking about forces, like causal force that communicates motion from one billiard ball to another, what we've put is a word for an impression that we didn't have, right? I didn't experience the causal force, I just experienced one billiard ball and another billiard ball. And so these metaphysical words become the storehouses of all of our prejudices and superstitions. And so that's really kind of how Hume ends the book. The ending of the Enquiry is really famous, He says something to the effect of, are you reading something that's trying to give you knowledge? Okay. Now, does it talk about relations of ideas, like mathematical truths or something like that? Or like a dictionary, right? Dictionaries just tell you how ideas are related to one another. Okay, no. Say no. Fine. Okay, well then, is it experimental observations and matters of facts? Say you're reading Spinoza's Ethics or something like that. He would say no, right? And so what does Hume say that you should do with that book in that case? You should cast it aside to the flames, right? It can only deceive you. It can never give you real knowledge of the way that the world is. And Hume is a skeptic precisely because he believes that the predominant attitude that we have in our daily superstition is to believe that we know more than we do, and to hide this superstition through metaphysical words and vocabulary that doesn't correspond to any possible experience. If philosophy is to be meaningful for human beings as they actually live, then they must have applicability to our lives and to our experiences, and not merely be concerned with what is outside or beyond them. And that's the general thrust of Hume's work and why he's a very interesting empiricist. He takes very common sense ideas that we have and really asks, what is that? Is that a matter of fact, or is it a relation of ideas? In his other texts, for example, the Treatise on Human Nature, he argues that there's no such thing as the self, right? What is this based in? Well, I have impressions of markers and pens and tables and chairs and maybe even pains and pleasures and so on. But I don't have any impression of, say, what Descartes calls a thinking substance. And so Hume, in this very interesting quasi-Buddhist way, comes to even doubt the reality of personal identity because he thinks of it as being inconsistent with empiricist theses. So to here, causal force goes out the window. And this is right when he got Newton, right? The European, especially the English continent, was very much celebrating the accomplishments of Newton and Newton's discovery, of Newtonian mechanical physics, which basically still works as an explanatory hypothesis on items of a certain size and scale. And so it's interesting that at this very moment of extreme scientific advancement, that Hume is able to, in a way, turn things back and enter into a reflective deliberation about what does all of this knowledge really get us? Where do we end up? What can we actually know and apply to our experiences and, in a way, transition from a kind of philosophical knowledge to an everyday knowledge? These are the questions that really motivated Humanist Enquiry, and I hope you found it interesting. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great week. Bye.